Rome didn't just defeat its enemies. It displayed them, and when the enemy was a queen, survival isn't mercy, it was punishment. Because Rome understood something terrifying. A woman could lose her throne, and still remain dangerous. Chapter 1. When victory became spectacle. Rome's military success was never meant to end on the battlefield. Victory only reached its true conclusion in the streets of the capital, where conquest was transformed into public ritual. From the early republic through the height of the empire, Roman power depended not only on defeating enemies, but on displaying that defeat in unmistakable terms. The Roman triumph was the ultimate expression of this ideology. Officially sanctioned by the Senate, a triumph celebrated a general's victory through a carefully staged procession. Spoils of war, captured weapons, and conquered territories were paraded before the population. Yet the most important exhibits were human. Enemy leaders, kings, princes, and especially queens, were marched through Rome as living proof of domination. Captured queens held particular symbolic value. Unlike kings, they represented dynastic continuity, political legitimacy, and future resistance. A defeated king could be executed or replaced. A queen carried bloodlines, alliances, and memory. Displaying her publicly, stripped of authority and autonomy, sent a message that Rome had conquered not just armies, but entire civilizations. These processions were not spontaneous celebrations. Every detail was calculated. Captives were dressed according to Roman expectations, sometimes in ceremonial or foreign attire designed to emphasize their otherness. Silence was enforced. Chains, often gilded, signaled control without concealing humiliation. The crowd's applause affirmed Rome's superiority, while the captive's presence warned against rebellion. This was not cruelty for its own sake. It was policy. Rome believed order depended on fear, and fear depended on spectacle. Glory demanded witnesses, and witnesses demanded victims. In this system, survival was never mercy, it was another instrument of power. Chapter 2. Queens on the battlefield. Who are they? The women Rome paraded in chains were not symbolic figures or ceremonial consorts. They were rulers in their own right, political actors who commanded armies, negotiated alliances, and governed territories that rivaled Rome in wealth and influence. Their capture represented not only military success, but the collapse of entire power structures. Zenobia of Palmyra is among the most documented examples. In the 3rd century CE, she ruled a vast Eastern empire stretching from Syria to Egypt, openly challenging Roman authority during a period of imperial instability. Ancient sources such as Zosimus and the Historia Augusta describe her as educated, multilingual, and politically astute. When Emperor Aurelian defeated her in 272 CE, her capture was treated as a major ideological victory. Earlier, in North Africa, Cleopatra Selene II, the daughter of Cleopatra VII, embodied dynastic continuity. Rome sought to control, though raised in Rome after her parents' defeat in 30 BCE. Her lineage alone represented a lingering threat tied to Egypt's former independence. Roman policy often focused less on punishment and more on containment. Even queens who never lived to be captured, like Boudica of the Iceni, shaped Roman anxieties. Her rebellion in Britain around 60 to 61 CE demonstrated how female leadership could mobilize resistance. Roman historians such as Tacitus framed her as a warning, proof that women, when allowed power, could destabilize imperial order. These queens were feared not because they lost, but because of what they had been. They ruled territories, commanded loyalty, and embodied identities Rome could not fully absorb. Their downfall was not merely personal. It marked the forced submission of cultures, traditions, and political systems that Rome viewed as incompatible with its vision of control. One day, they were sovereigns. The next, they were prisoners, still dangerous in the eyes of Rome, even in defeat. Chapter 3. Chains of Gold. Capture without mercy. When Roman forces captured a queen, the treatment that followed was deliberate and methodical. These women were not handled as ordinary prisoners of war. They were classified as hostes publicae, public enemies of the Roman state, and managed accordingly. From the moment of capture, control replaced combat. High-status captives were immediately isolated. Roman commanders understood that influence did not vanish with defeat. Queens were separated from followers, advisors, and family members to prevent communication. And symbolic authority. Ancient military manuals and historical accounts indicate that silence and uncertainty were intentional tools designed to dismantle resistance without physical violence. Transport to Rome could take months. During this time, captives were heavily guarded and often restrained with chains. Literary sources describe these restraints as conspicuous rather than purely functional. Gold or decorated metal was sometimes used, particularly for royal prisoners, to communicate dominance rather than poverty. The message was unmistakable. Rome could afford mercy, humiliation, and restraint all at once. The psychological toll of this journey was severe. Queens who had ruled courts and commanded armies were reduced to objects of state property, moved according to imperial schedules. They were rarely informed of their fate. Execution, imprisonment, or public display remained possibilities until the final moment. This uncertainty was not accidental. Roman authority relied on predictability for its citizens and unpredictability for its enemies. By denying captives clarity, Rome extended the battlefield into the realm of the mind. Cruelty was carefully regulated, disguised as discipline and procedure. To Roman officials, this was not abuse. It was order. The captive queen's body was preserved, but her autonomy was systematically dismantled, long before she ever set foot in the capital. Chapter 4. The Triumph Parade. Glory built on shame. For a captured queen, arrival in Rome did not signal resolution. It marked the beginning of her public function. The triumph, Rome's most prestigious honor for a victorious general, depended on visual proof that foreign power had been broken. Human captives were central to that proof. Triumphs followed a fixed route through the city, moving from the Campus Martius to the Temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus. Along this path, crowds gathered to witness Rome's supremacy. Among the prisoners marched enemy leaders, carefully arranged by status. Queens were placed where they could be seen, not lost among ordinary captives. Their visibility mattered. Ancient descriptions, including those of Plutarch and Cassius Dio, note that captives were dressed to emphasize contrast. Some wore traditional royal garments, others were forced into stylized costumes that highlighted their foreign identity. These choices were made by Roman officials, not by the captives themselves. Silence was expected. Any display of defiance risked immediate punishment. The purpose of the triumph was not negotiation or justice. It was pedagogy. Rome taught its citizens what happened to those who resisted. A queen who once issued commands now walked under guard, her presence reinforcing the permanence of Roman victory. The crowd's cheers were not directed at her suffering, but at the power that caused it. This spectacle depended on imbalance. The general rode in a chariot, crowned with laurel. The captives walked. The state celebrated. The defeated endured. By reducing powerful women to symbols of submission, Rome transformed personal downfall into collective reassurance. Order had been restored, and it had been made visible. Chapter 5. Execution, Exile, or Erasure. The triumph did not determine a captured queen's fate. It only concluded her usefulness as a public symbol. What followed depended on politics, precedent, and Rome's calculation of risk. There was no single outcome, but three paths appeared repeatedly in Roman practice: execution, controlled survival, or disappearance from record. Execution was reserved for those Rome considered irredeemable threats. It often took place privately, after the triumph had ended. Ancient sources indicate that captives could be strangled or otherwise killed away from public view, preserving the image of Roman restraint while eliminating danger. This fate was common for male leaders. But queens were sometimes spared immediate death because of their symbolic value. Others were allowed to live under strict control. Zenobia of Palmyra, after her defeat in 272 CE, was reportedly spared by Emperor Aurelian. Later accounts describe her living in enforced retirement near Tivoli, removed from politics and closely supervised. Whether fully accurate or partially idealized, the narrative reflects a Roman preference for neutralizing influence without creating martyrs. A third fate was erasure. Some queens were married into Roman-aligned dynasties, relocated to distant provinces, or confined in obscurity. Cleopatra Selene II, though not executed, was raised in Rome and later married to Juba II of Mauritania under Roman oversight. Her survival served Roman interests, but her autonomy was tightly limited. These outcomes reveal Rome's deeper concern. Death ended a life, survival risked memory, lineage, and rebellion. For female rulers, whose authority could persist through family, culture, or legend, Rome often chose silence over spectacle. To be forgotten was sometimes the most complete defeat. Chapter 6: The Ones Rome Tried to Rewrite. Rome's control over captured queens did not end with their physical fate. It extended into history itself. The Roman world was deeply aware of the power of narrative, and its historians, poets, and officials shaped how defeated enemies would be remembered, or not remembered at all. Most surviving accounts of these queens come from Roman authors such as Tacitus, Cassius Dio, Plutarch, and later compilers like the Historia Augusta. These writers were not neutral observers. They wrote for Roman audiences, under Roman political assumptions, and often with moral or ideological objectives. Female rulers were frequently portrayed as abnormal, dangerous, or excessive, reinforcing Roman beliefs about gender and authority. This distortion was not accidental. By framing queens as irrational, overly ambitious, or morally suspect, Roman narratives justified their defeat. Zenobia, for example, was alternately depicted as noble but misguided, or as an overreaching usurper. Boudica, whose rebellion nearly expelled Rome from Britain, was described in vivid detail, but always as a cautionary figure, not a legitimate sovereign. In many cases, silence replaced criticism. Records simply stop. Names vanish from inscriptions. Court details disappear. This absence was itself a political outcome. Without archives, monuments, or local histories preserved, later generations encountered only Rome's version of events. Modern historians rely on fragments, archaeology, and non-Roman sources to reconstruct these lives. Coins, inscriptions, and regional records sometimes contradict Roman accounts, revealing rulers who governed effectively and commanded loyalty. The danger lies not in what Rome said, but in what it omitted. When only the victor's voice survives, power is mistaken for truth. The histories of these queens remind us that domination continues long after conquest, especially on the page. Chapter 7: When Victory Went Too Far. Rome's system of conquest was built on discipline and spectacle, but there were moments when even Roman observers questioned its excesses. As the empire expanded, the treatment of defeated enemies, especially high-profile captives, began to expose tensions within Roman political and moral culture. Public unease often surfaced when punishment appeared disproportionate or counterproductive. Tacitus, while loyal to Roman order, recorded discomfort with unnecessary cruelty, particularly when it provoked further unrest rather than stability. The brutal suppression of Boudica's revolt in Britain, followed by widespread reprisals, secured territory but left deep resentment that required decades of military presence to contain. The display and humiliation of royal women also created contradictions. Roman ideology emphasized virtus, restraint, and rational authority. Excessive cruelty risked appearing tyrannical rather than just. Emperors such as Augustus deliberately avoided triumphs over fellow Romans, or overly theatrical punishment, recognizing that spectacle could undermine legitimacy if pushed too far. There were political consequences as well. Harsh treatment of defeated elites sometimes destabilized newly conquered regions, forcing Rome to expend more resources maintaining control. Mercy, when calculated, often proved more effective than fear. This reality influenced decisions to spare certain queens, not out of compassion, but pragmatism. Over time, the gap between Rome's self-image and its actions became harder to ignore. The same rituals that once symbolized order began to reveal insecurity. When domination required constant reinforcement through humiliation, victory lost its confidence. In these moments, Roman power appeared less triumphant and more defensive, suggesting that the empire's greatest fear was not resistance, but the possibility that its authority was no longer unquestioned. Chapter 8: Legacy of the Lost Queens. Although Rome attempted to control the memory of captured queens, it never fully succeeded. Their legacies endured beyond imperial records, preserved through regional traditions, material evidence, and later historical re-examination. What Rome sought to diminish often resurfaced in altered but resilient forms. In the eastern provinces, Zenobia remained a figure of cultural pride long after Palmyra's fall. Archaeological remains, inscriptions, and coinage attest to the stability and ambition of her reign, challenging Roman portrayals of her as merely a rebel. In Britain, Boudica became a symbol of resistance centuries later, remembered less through Roman texts than through collective memory and later reinterpretation. These queens came to represent more than political defeat. They embodied challenges to imperial authority and to Roman assumptions about gender and power. Their stories survived precisely because they unsettled established narratives. Each revival of their memory reflected changing values, national identity, resistance to empire, or the recognition of women as historical agents. Modern scholarship has further reshaped their legacy. By comparing Roman accounts with archaeological data and non-Roman sources, historians have recovered more balanced perspectives. Coins bearing royal titles, city foundations, and administrative reforms point to capable rulers, rather than anomalies. The persistence of these figures demonstrates the limits of erasure. Empires can silence individuals, but they cannot fully control how history is remembered. The queens Rome paraded in defeat remain part of the historical record, not as trophies, but as evidence of power that once rivaled Rome itself. Chapter 9: Final Reflection. Power that devours itself. Rome's treatment of captured queens exposes the deeper logic of empire. Military conquest was never sufficient on its own. Authority had to be displayed, reinforced, and repeatedly justified. The public humiliation of defeated rulers, especially women who had exercised real power, was intended to eliminate future resistance by demonstrating absolute control. Yet this practice also revealed insecurity. An empire confident in its dominance would not need to parade its enemies or erase their memory so aggressively. Rome's insistence on spectacle suggests a fear that authority, once challenged, might be challenged again. Captured queens represented not only defeated states, but alternative models of leadership that Rome could not easily absorb. The line between strength and cruelty was narrow. When Rome crossed it, victory lost its moral clarity. Order became coercion, justice became convenience. The rituals that celebrated dominance also exposed its cost, both to the conquered and to Rome's own ideals. These women did not fall because they were weak. They fell because Rome was stronger at that moment. Their subsequent treatment shows how power behaves when it seeks permanence. It does not merely defeat opponents. It attempts to control their future, their memory, and their meaning. The question that remains is not whether Rome won, but what that victory required. In silencing these queens, Rome preserved its empire, but at the expense of acknowledging that its authority was never absolute. The echoes of those lost rulers endure as a reminder that even the greatest powers are shaped by the fears they try to hide. If history like this matters to you, stories that empires tried to erase, subscribe to the channel. Because the past doesn't just belong to the victors, and there are still voices waiting to be heard.